Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. We are excited to be about to launch a panel on patient perspectives in novel therapeutics, value-based discussions. My name is Craig Martin. I'm the president and chief engagement officer for Rhythm Health, consultancy that works with biotech and health tech companies and organizations. I'm also proud to be a Global Genes board member and chair of the Corporate Alliance. Before we get started and I introduce the other panelists, I just wanted to cover a few brief housekeeping notes. First, you'll note that you are all on mute, and we're doing that in order to avoid background noise. But we do want to hear from you, and please take advantage of the chat button, which is at the bottom of your screen, to ask questions at any time throughout the session. We'll get to as many of them as we can, but if we can't, we'll try and follow up after the session to the degree possible. Also, we encourage you to share any insights or comments you have via social media. The event hashtag is hashtag 2020GG Summit. And we also encourage you to tag at Global Genes. So on to the main event. And I'm pleased to welcome a distinguished panel that includes Eric Faulkner, who is the VP of Precision and Transformative Medicine at Evidera, Vanessa Vogel-Farley from RareX, and Anita Burrell, principal at Anita Burrell Consulting company. They'll each share a bit more background on themselves as we dive into the conversation. But first, I wanted to set the stage a bit for why we're having a conversation about value-based discussions. As many of you may have seen and observed in recent years, there's been a lot of innovation focused on development of therapeutics in rare disease. If you look at regenerative medicine, for example, which is things like gene therapies, which offer exciting promise, there are about 1,100 of those regenerative medicines in the pipeline now. And as you see, more than half, 647 of those, are focused around rare disease. So that's good news. The not so good news is that as the science has moved very quickly, regulatory and payer systems have struggled to keep up. And regulators are now trying to figure out how to evaluate this new science and the efficacy and safety of treatments in an expedited way, because many of these reviews have been moved quickly. And you've got payers who are trying to evaluate new therapies that have pretty transformative impacts that may make the difference between someone surviving well beyond their childhood years and living a relatively normal life versus what would have been a very different scenario without a treatment. And so we find ourselves struggling with decisions about, how do you place a value on treatments of this type? So that brings us to our main conversation, and to talk a little bit more about the landscape, I'm going to turn it over to Eric.
Okay. Thank you, Craig. Are we going to go through slides here or just have a general discussion? Can you hear me?
Yes. Is the slide advanced? It is on my screen.
Yeah, I can't see the slide advancing.
Okay. Maybe I can get, maybe we can get Molly or someone to advance it. It's showing up as live on my screen.
Yep, why don't you just start, Eric, and you can, we'll figure it out how to get your live view.
Okay, I can't even see the slides. I can see them at the top, but I can't see them on something that I can read.
Turn on your live view. If it's white on the bottom left, you should see live view. And if it's white, make it blue. So click on it. And you should see it come up in the middle, and you'll see the slides.
Yep. Okay, there we go. Sorry. And we've already talked about the good news and not so good news. One of the things, this comes from the recently launched Guiding Principles of Rare Disease report. Along with a number of trials, one of the challenges in rare disease, and from my background, I started in pediatric medical genetics in rare disease as a geneticist and have been involved in rare disease for my whole career. But this is just a quick snapshot to help us set the stage a bit. Even though rare diseases are often treated as rare diseases from an individual evaluative perspective, when you really add all of them up, you can see that they're right there in terms of impact with diabetes and arguably significantly more representative than other areas that are often thought of as key health priorities and initiatives. And there's a push-pull issue with this, looking at a lot of our payer processes for evaluating new treatments evolved around broader treatment areas. So some of the ways that these therapies are evaluated may not take into account the full uniqueness. Not all rare diseases are made the same. But here, this is just showing that when you really stack it up, the impact is substantial and maybe more than stakeholders realize. And so as we move into this next phase of multiple launches where you've got literally hundreds of therapies in development for rare disease and an unprecedented potential to transform or cure, in some cases, the disease, then how we balance between ensuring that there's sufficient focus in the broader community, payer, provider, policymaker, but do so in a manner that goes beyond a single yardstick approach, that takes into account different archetypes of rare disease, whether it's a fast, neonatal fatal condition where things happen very quickly and there are severe consequences, or whether the disease unfolds over some number of years, 30 to 40 years in some cases, before those consequences also occur in the same way. There's a lot of variability here, so striking the right balance as we go forward is critical, and the patient voice is part of that to really understand and characterize elements of the disease the system may not be ideally set up to evaluate. We don't have to belabor this one, but as already mentioned, there was a NewDig study. NewDigs is basically a collaborative group run through MIT that did a study looking at, and this is focusing on cell and gene therapies, that in a short term there will be 30 product indications. One of the things that I focus on with my volunteer hat is running an emerging technology institute for National Association of Managed Care Physicians. And through that group, we have about 100 commercial payers, and we've talked extensively about rare disease and about cell and gene therapies. And in some cases, the payers struggle with the cost of rare diseases, even though the budget impact is more minimal, considered more minimal. They haven't really begun to think about the aggregate impacts yet, but cell and gene therapies represent, despite their promise, a challenge because of the single administration nature, where the value capture and payment may occur around that single event, unlike what you see with, say, enzyme replacement therapies, where the patient is dosed throughout their lifetime. And some of the payers have, expressed concerns in that cash flow, managing the impact of therapies that have this sort of cost bracket, but there's a balance between showing them the transformative benefit, which they are extremely supportive of in rare disease. The payers are first and foremost clinicians, and they want to see these things succeed, but they do recognize that the system for certain types of technologies may not have been built to easily measure them or receive them. And we can talk about how folks can get more involved in terms of solutions as we go forward. And I don't know if you want me to transition to Anita for this one, Craig, or you want me to keep going?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it'd be good because I think you've set up the problem, which is on the one hand, all this exciting and really interesting innovation coming through the pipeline and starting to reach patients. On the other hand, a system that is struggling with how we're going to pay for all of it. And therefore, it's important for this community to understand where and how they could get involved to make sure that their voices are included in discussions taking place around just those issues.
Yeah.
So it'd be helpful if maybe as a group we could walk through what we mean when we talk about value-based discussions.
Yeah, and I think there's a good opportunity here to segue between what Eric's already alluded to, which is part of the problem that that payers are facing, because we know that obviously everybody would like to be able to supply anything that would have a beneficial effect within the market to the patients who need those. But they're trying to make a decision about, well, how much value do we get from this, versus all of the other things that we're being asked to pay for. And I think that's hard sometimes when we sit on one side to think, why would anybody not want to make this available? It's not that they don't want to make it available. It's just that obviously you've got to make a choice sometimes about what it is that you can fund, and that wave of new therapies coming through. And as Eric showed, the cumulative number, so on any single rare disease, it really isn't a big impact. But when you put them all together, and then you see all the approvals coming through, that's when people are going to ask more and more, what do we get from having these therapies available to people? And we want to walk through this in a sort of general way, but we want to be able to show people that what happens is that the bodies that look at safety, efficacy, and quality, which are the regulatory bodies, decide to give the product a license. But the payers are the people who have to, in the end, make sure that those products are able to be reimbursed, so that there isn't a large fall that happens onto the patients themselves. And they do that through looking at comparative effectiveness, so not efficacy, does it work, but how well does it work, and then cost effectiveness. What is it that I get for the money? How much offset does that be able to create within the health journey of that patient? And that's what people mean by health technology assessment. And it's not something that we've really been used to very much in the US systems, but we're seeing ICER, the Institute for Clinical Effectiveness Review, come through in that Massachusetts setting to provide evidence for people. And I think the clip here that we have on the right is the one that makes the headlines, and they've been making headlines, provocative headlines around what we can get and how we should pay for different diseases. So if I can hand over here to Eric, do you want to go back on some of those things that we talked about some of the difficulties payers are having?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, in the United States, ICER is unique because it incorporates both the clinical assessment and the health economics assessment. Most payers, both public and private payers in the United States, disaggregate the clinical from the economics. So they'll make decisions on whether it has clinical impact first, and then they'll deal with the pricing and budget impact as a secondary assessment, whereas ICER is more like NICE in the UK, looking at both in a combinatorial way. There are a couple of things that are probably important to point out for rare disease, especially when you think about cell and gene therapies or other more transformative type rare disease treatments. Because you're dealing with small populations, sometimes that brings clinical development challenges. Many of the rare diseases therapies are fast-tracked, and fast-track is great in terms of making things available to the patient quickly, and great from a regulatory perspective. But payers will often use the term fast-track to non-reimbursement if the right evidence package is not available for them to be able to look at it. So many of the therapies, including the cell and gene therapies, have launched with single-arm studies where you only have one arm, and to get to comparative effectiveness, you often have to pull up real-world evidence. And that real-world evidence in rare disease can be somewhat more challenging to get at. You know, we're seeing some of the newer therapies, payers begin to look more definitively at biomarker subpopulations. So even hypothetically monogenic diseases are more complicated under the hood. In the United States, we've even seen with, you know, certain therapy launches, Strimvelis, for example, or not Strimvelis, but Spinraza, be one of the first times in the United States we've seen initial, and it's changed since then, you know, limiting out certain subtypes of patients that weren't included in the trial. So making sure that there's enough representation of certain subtypes is really critical. And for a lot of these advanced therapies, whoever is in the clinical study is who will be covered and reimbursed. That they're much more reluctant, because of the price points of these therapies, to go outside of what's defined in the clinical study population, and a lot like with the case I just mentioned, are certainly able to drill down further and limit beyond what is label approved to a much more narrow population based on their own assessments.
So
the other
Eric,
challenge,
Eric, does that lead to then unique challenges in terms of trial design and making sure that there's sufficient diversity and variability amongst the trial cohort as well?
It really means upfront having a good understanding of the natural history of the disease, which may not be as well understood compared to broader diseases when you talk rare, right? So having that natural history data to inform what the trial design should look like is a key first step, because the payers will have very limited appetite for some of the more costly advanced therapies for what I would call faith-based coverage. So again, whatever patient population are in the trial are the ones that would have access to the therapy from a reimbursement perspective. Now, as you develop additional evidence, that changes. It did change in the case of Spinraza. The other big area that you see often is where a rare disease has a long phenotypical time before you start seeing signs and symptoms, so that your critical endpoints are based on surrogates instead of what I would call hard outcomes like mortality, morbidity, impacts of quality of life. And the third key area is, you know, really understanding and baking in the patient-centric benefits and the caregiver, you know, impacts of a new therapy may not be something that all U.S. commercial payers equally appreciate. Some of them, like the Blues plans, definitely take it into account. Other smaller regional payers may not look at the patient-centric benefits, but that's really a key area where the patient can get involved to make sure that the scope and nature of the particular disease is characterized and the implications and linkages to the treatment impacts are as clear as humanly possible.
Yeah,
so
and
does
to
this
follow on, I was going to say, follow on to Eric's point there, Craig. It's one of those things where I think he's brought up the real point, which is about getting the patient voice in front of these bodies that are making the decisions, because there is so much that we really want to be able to put into context, and that requires that discussion. So I think one of the things, if we focus on ICER for a moment, that's quite encouraging, is that actually we're seeing them try to make a move towards incorporating the patient voice. And this is really quite positive in the way that they're moving forward. If you go to the next slide for me, they've really got 4 areas that they're focusing on. They did this, they updated their value assessment framework, which is how do we understand what we're getting from this new therapy versus the existing way of caring for these patients, I'll just say, because it often isn't treatment. So one of the things that they did do was actually recognize the ultra-rare diseases and the ways in which they had to think about these slightly different. And they actually wanted to be able to bring the public and the patients into that effort. So I really like the fact that we're seeing here these different ways, and you can see them on the right-hand side of the screen, that they're actually trying to get not only the experience of the treatment, but also that context that we were talking about. So, Eric, do you want to add anything on this? I think it was a really, really important move for ICER to start looking at patient views.
And I think it kind of parallels what we've seen happen with NICE, right? So NICE, at one point some number of years ago, developed the highly specialized technologies group to help address special issues with ultra-rare disease. And it was kind of a game changer because it opened the door to look at things a little differently and through a lens that was more sensitive to the kinds of complex evidentiary issues you get into with rare disease. So at least this reflects, people had in the past criticized ICER around not having this view, and I think it's at least showing that they're trying to evolve a more reflective process to get at, you know, special considerations that you would see with this patient population, broadly cast.
So one of the things that I would ask this group is, does this set up somewhat of a conflict between rare diseases as a collective and some of the larger chronic diseases? In that, you know, the ICER evaluation takes into account, you know, distinctly disease by disease, the patient's voice, which is great. That's a step forward. But collectively, I think what we start to hear from payers is, well, but when you start to add up all these distinct rare diseases, the burden to the system is greater than it might be for drugs that they've evaluated that, you know, maybe in a chronic disease have kind of an incremental and sustaining effect, not a transformative effect like many of these therapies do.
I think that the thing is that with the system that's been created for these chronic, the system's been created for chronic usage and the payers of the chronic treatments. Whereas when we come forward from rare, we have everything from those chronic needs. So these treatments that are created that you do need to give more than once and over time to sustain life. And then we have the transformative treatments where rare is kind of breaking that system. We're looking for something that is going to be able to come in that side door. The example in FDA, that new fast track is a great example of how the system is changing to be able to handle these more dynamic and diverse use cases. And it's not going to happen overnight, but there's definitely these pain points that as they're being identified, the discussion where the patient voice and the patient communities are able to come forward and say, you know, let's think about it a little bit differently is really going to be important. I think that there's a lot of really great movements towards that. And like the access to critical therapies that Global Genes put together that I think all of us, except Anita, were on, really does bring together and convene the key stakeholders that brings the patient voice to the middle. So I think there's a conflict, but I don't think it's a conflict it's a conflict bringing us together to be able to continue the conversations to make changes to the systems that we've been kind of forced to be put on.
I think that one challenge also is that comes along with, you know, proliferation of focus in rare disease is the ability to leverage precision medicine to basically go after other niche populations too. So even for the broad areas, a lot of the development emphasis, not all of it, but a good bit, is focusing on narrower populations. Now payers, particularly in Europe, but also in the United States, will still think about the broader disease, even if you, as they would say, salami slice it down to a more niche population. They still think about it in terms of the broad disease, whereas rare, they do think about the aggregate impacts, and the aggregate impacts are beginning to strain systems. You know, payers at the NAMCP, you know, raised the hepatitis C initial drugs as causing some small health plans to go bankrupt. And the concern is that once a lot of these other therapies that are much more expensive per unit price come out, that it will put a strain on the system, not only in the aggregate cost and budget impact, but also where there are single administration therapies like cell and gene therapies, where the system wasn't really built to do anything much more than pay for them at one time, at least in the US. We're trying to change that, but it requires rethinking, how we evaluate evidence over time, how we get the patient voice in and know what we're measuring, and how we change a system that was never built for the kinds of transformative therapies that we're seeing come today that can transform not only patient lives, but change, caregivers' experience and a whole bunch of other things, create efficiencies in care paradigms that we don't even think about at the payer level right now. What happens when you cure a disease or transform it? A bunch of things change in terms of patient management, but the system's not yet set up to really reflect and evaluate that at the HTA level.
So
it's true.
and a lot of what we've been talking about is focused on U.S. and Europe. One of the questions we had is, how do we see these therapies reaching developing countries like India? And the example pointed out is there are 3 drugs approved for SMA in the U.S., but none commercially available or affordable in India. So maybe we can talk a little bit about opportunities for folks to be involved in conversations that may help to influence what's going on elsewhere in the world.
I think it's tough. Sorry, go on, Anita. No, you go ahead. Sorry about that.
I'll put my view in, and then because you've got the viewpoint that I really like, which is from the patient side. I was thinking, there's 2 ways of going at this, and the first one is that those products they're actually approved have still got to collect data, particularly in rare settings. This is not novel for rare, but it's more important for rare because of the fact that we don't understand the history. So one of the aspects is to work on with the manufacturer side is they are still collecting data. So there are opportunities to do after approval work. So obviously the clinical trials that go on to gain approval, but there are always studies that go on after approval, usually because the regulatory authority wants to ensure that we've got the safety and efficacy that we were expecting or saw in the pre-trial, in the pre-approval period. So hopefully there's a way to be able to work there on a compassionate use program, for example, on a registry, for example, but also on the policy side, because if people remember way back to the 80s, HIV was an issue, obviously, that was very, very concerning for a number of fairly small minority patients at the time. But it became such an issue because they advocated for ring-fenced funds. And I'm not sure that we can go exactly that way in every country, but that advocacy aspect from patients is extremely important, to raise the awareness for it, to work out solutions that can happen. Because we're seeing, to Eric's point about this one-time big payment for a number of years, we're seeing amortization suggestions, we're seeing the Netflix model suggestion, we're seeing ways that people are trying to come forward creatively to solve those. So from my point of view, I wanted to put those 2. But Vanessa, I really want to go back to you because I'm sorry I jumped in at the beginning. I just thought that would be a different view to yours.
I think the thing is the international market, like we're talking about India, we're talking about developing countries, even just the idea of making sure that we identify what that market looks like, how many patients exist when you're talking about either those compassionate use things or those the access to when different pharma organizations have, compassionate use. You can go in through their, oh my goodness, I'm missing the term right now. I'm too completely undercaffeinated. But when you can go in and say a patient can't afford it, they would, they give it to the patient. They want to know how many patients are in that market. So just identifying that registry aspect where the patient advocacy or the groups and the communities can come together and collect data just on even just these patients exist. This is their etiologies. These are their diagnoses, and they exist. This is how many we have in India. This is how many we have in China. This is how many we have in Australia. So when those markets open up, those industry partners and those biopharma partners can at least have a better view of the actual numbers that they're looking at when they're determining their value, when they're determining these conversations. Because right now, we have a really big problem in rare that we're not able to get those numbers, especially as these new diagnoses are coming up. We're talking about these small N's. Maybe they aren't small N's, but we just can't find them, or we can't identify them. I mean, I think we have another slide coming up talking about digital health, using the technology and digital health things that are coming up to identify and know what these markets look like much more effectively than we ever have before. And using the patient engagement and the patient advocacy groups to do that is going to be the key to changing the system, or making the system that it can meet the needs of the payers, the clinicians, and the patients much more effectively, and bring that cost down. So that's the patient perspective, that making sure that we're working together to say, we have this ability to identify those markets and characterize those markets and help with that natural history piece.
And access to data is sort of king in rare disease, right? It's kind of gets at the heart of what RareX is trying to help solve for. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it, to your point. And so really being able to act, you can't even, sometimes in some cases, it's harder to even get at the natural history and other elements because the data for patients is so fragmented across certain data sources and other things that it's just more challenging when there are fewer patients. It's just the way that the data, base analysis world exists. But even beyond that, in some of the other markets that may not have as complex and or evolved, if you want to use that term, of a basically payer system and the connection between regulatory and payer systems, there may be opportunities to, implement other kind of contractual approaches and things from the manufacturer standpoint that may be more challenging to institute in a market like the U.S., for example, where you may not have something like best price issues as a barrier to being creative in terms of how you solve those problems to make sure that access is available.
And Eric, I wonder, and for the panel as a whole, what your thoughts are in terms of along the lines of being creative, given the uniqueness of some of these gene therapies where you've got a conditional approval, but a requirement for a manufacturer to track over some period of years the durability of the impact of that treatment amongst distinct populations that are often dispersed pretty broadly. And so acceptance within one country or environment or one reimbursement scheme might require a broader look. And is that a potential pathway for other countries that may have struggled to get access to be part of some broader initiatives?
It could be. When you look at global clinical trials, it's really trying to find patients where they're at in the most effective way. And there may be relationships that the governments of some of these places where patients are recruited, which can be, some emerging markets, have some sort of reciprocity thing that enables or accelerates the ability to collect data over time. And there could be some horse trading to make sure that if we're providing the data, that we at least have the ability to leverage the data to benefit our market, which would be a longer term type of consideration.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there and just say I was on a call yesterday with real world evidence for decisions. And part of that is creating a framework. At least they started creating a framework in Europe to talk about how that could help. And thinking about patient protection. Data protection is a big deal, so there are issues in this, but really be able to create that data set which would be able to be accessed anonymously and securely across Europe so that some of these things would happen. And this example is only a small one from the UK, but I thought it was interesting to look at because this is a way in which one of the collaborators with the NHS is working with a patient advocacy group in mesothelioma, which is a rare cancer, obviously, to integrate patients' both opinions about their experience, but also about their outcomes directly into the clinical record. And that to me is huge because it makes it completely combined, not so that we've got patient views separate from clinical evidence. The two things are completely combined. So it's only one example, but that digitalization of our healthcare record really helps us to think about, okay, so what opportunities are there to do that?
Additionally, the use of digital health where you are improving the clinical record, where right now in rare disease, you go in and you talk about the worst thing that happened that week versus collecting better clinical data about your actual disorder. So improving using technology and using these sorts of things to better characterize that in clinic, that when the patient is giving real world evidence as well, or you're collecting data outside patient reported outcomes, those things do travel together. It's something that's the learning healthcare system. It's where you're helping improve the healthcare that the rare, and specifically in rare disease, that's very, very needed since there's so many specialties that everybody sees. But how do you make sure that data is combinable and really can travel together? Because it's one of those things. It's the use case. It's the surrogate endpoints. It's all of the other things. Being able to find those more effectively and more quickly, especially for these rare genetic disorders.
So Vanessa, can you just explain a little bit about RareX and how within that context you might approach addressing some of those challenges?
So RareX is a new initiative around data, and it's more around being able to federate data that exists and collection of data that's more structured and standard, that's learned, that kind of that learning healthcare system data structure where you're collecting similar data across groups, not that they're disparate data sets or not that they're siloed, but that's the data collection program. The other big piece of this is data federation. It talks similarly to Anita's example of what's happening in Europe. In a de-identified way, how can we best get data together and federated in a cloud to be able to do those comparison cases and look across data sets and find these more, the signal to noise, especially in the rare space, that when you're going into it, looking at value assessment, when biopharma partners are saying, is this worth coming into this space, or is this worth maybe repurposing a drug to this other rare disease set, where these data sources are much more accessible. So the federation part of RareX is where there's a data source maybe in Europe that's de-identified, that can be identified and can be federated. There's a data source in India that can be de-identified and on the cloud. Respecting all data rules and regulations, because we know that there are so many across states, across countries, across any borders. We're respecting those, but still making sure the patient's saying, like, we need the data together, giving that a space, and making sure that access, being able to look and see and analyze is there. So it's really putting the patient's data together, saying that we know that this data exists. It gives it a place to come in a cloud-based manner and being used much more effectively for all of these stakeholders. So it can really drive this process forward faster by giving it just a place to convene. It's a convener space for data federation and knowing when these data sets exist. So when we bring through these big data efforts, wherever they exist in different countries or different states, we can at least put them someplace that they can be looked across, but it's all cloud-based. So it's a very, very exciting new initiative that we can say, if you have data that's out there, if these are massive, massive country-based initiatives, we have the technology to be able to say, this data exists, come and look at it. Let's make sure that if there's data missing, how do we get that data and where can we put it? How can we collect it effectively?
And Vanessa, what about for things like long-term, follow-up?
The long-term follow-up. So right now, these transformative treatments really do need a place to be able to collect data long-term. We know that some of these companies, once they create a drug, they might not stay in business. They might be sold. They might be moved. But to collect that data long-term, the FDA and regulators are saying they need to collect data anywhere between 10 to 15 years from their sample population. How do you do that in a way that can be managed long-term and can be connecting to the patients? RareX is looking to solve that problem, where the long-term follow-up piece is in an aggregate set. It's being able to follow the patient, even if they move around the country. It's using that technology and that virtual platform to follow that patient across time and make sure that data is available to the regulators and whoever else needs it, to make sure that the follow-up data that Anita was talking about is collected in a safe and secure manner.
Right. So, we've talked a little bit about some of the various initiatives that are going on and on the importance of being involved. Eric and Vanessa, I know you were both heavily involved in the ACT initiative, which we referenced earlier. Can you share a little bit more about that initiative and the intent behind it and what opportunities it may present for patient communities?
Sure. And on the slide, we have the sort of top line results of at least one thread of that initiative, which is getting at guiding principles of rare disease. And these 5 principles were designed so that ideally, no matter what stakeholder type you are, patient, advocate, physician, payer, policymaker, that all 5 of these you can look at face value and say, yes, I believe in this for every single rare disease situation, if we've done it right. And these 5 things also serve as the lens. So some of these areas have been, discussed quite a bit in the literature or in other settings, et cetera. For example, the diagnostic odyssey that patients go through has been discussed definitively, and there have been some major market movements in terms of trying to actively reduce, in certain markets, the diagnostic odyssey for rare disease. Some of these areas we're making reasonable progress on. Other areas we have a lot of work to do, but these 5 areas basically serve as a lens through which patients, advocates, and others can engage the system to help ensure, to look at how are we doing for each of these principles, and also identify, and the report takes an initial stab at identifying some of the main steps that we would need to take to fill in the gaps that do exist in the system today. Vanessa, I don't know if you want to add on top.
No, I think the Access to Critical Therapies Working Group brought together all of the stakeholders, save for payers. The payers were the only ones that weren't present the first time we started with this, but it brought together the patient voice, it brought together the biopharma partners, it brought together the clinicians, it brought together researchers to really take a look at the access to critical therapies and what are the big gaps that we've identified. And as Eric was saying, these 5 that were come up with, this was a very iterative process. We wanted to look at from soup to nuts. What were the gaps and the things that we're not seeing that are affecting access to critical therapies, and how can we address those in the rare disease space and put this forward to payers and biopharma partners who are going into this to develop new treatments, and say these are the things that we need to these are the principles we need to guide your rare disease programs, that these should be at the center, because these are the things that patients and patient families are dealing with every day. I think that we started out this talking about value-based assessments. Value means different things to different people, but for the access to clinical therapies, it's value to the actual payers and the biopharma partners. But the value of the patient, the value to the patients needs to be part of that conversation too. And that's kind of what we wanted to get together for these guiding principles. And I think we did a pretty good job. But if you have any questions about the ACT, please email Eric or myself, and we can let you know about that. Or if you're interested in being part of the conversation as it continues, please let us know as well.
And we also have a series of 3 webinars that will get at and go deeper into discussions on each of these principles. I'm sorry, Craig. I didn't know if I stole your thought.
What I was going to highlight is I think now the opportunity is to really go out and inform and educate payers and others about these principles and make sure the patient's voice is part of decisions that are made around value.
Yeah.
And each of those webinars will include payers. Each of the webinars will include payers as part of the discussion. So we'll be able to have that dynamic back and forth. And the initial prep for the first call was really heartening, because the payer was definitely on board to support ensuring that rare disease patients have access, but acknowledging some of the challenges. I'm sorry.
Exactly.
Yep. So we've got about a little less than 15 minutes left. We want to make sure we carve out enough time for us to address some of the questions that have been coming in via the chat feature. I'm gonna pose these and try and direct them, but feel free to jump in if you've got a perspective on it. We got a question about can we talk about initiatives around reinsurance in both private and public insurance? Does anybody have any information on that?
So reinsurance is basically insuring the insurers, as I like to generalize it, down to what I can understand. And it's one of the ways that has been proposed to be able to deal with this issue. If you've got, basically it's like that one person in the pack that burns a house down and everybody else's policies go up, because they've had to cover these large one-off type events. And I think the idea here is one that would fit within the US market and could be an option. There's different ways to be able to look at that. That's one of them. Obviously, the way in which rare diseases get funded can be due to individual commercial insurers. It can be a government program. So remember, the end-stage renal disease has become a government program over time within the US because of the large costs that it bore at the beginning of the program. HIV was, as to my understanding in the United States, the same at its initiation. It was taken to be outside of the commercial markets to be able to solve. So perhaps there is an option here for us to ask for CMS type involvement. But I like some of the ones that have been coming up between commercial and the manufacturer, which are these ideas of, amortization or paying smaller amounts over a longer period of time rather than having to buy your house at one bit. When we buy a house, none of us have that money in the bank. So what we do is we agree to pay it over a period of time. And we could even pay a little bit more over a period of time. That's the idea with mortgages. But we want to be able to spread it out. Now, of course, there's the issue there about when people change insurers and so on. But those are practical matters to me. Those are logistical matters which we can solve. So I think reinsurance is one idea, but I think there are other great ideas in the marketplace to be able to deal with the sustainability of funding for these types of new, these are transformative therapies, but we've got to deal with the other side. Eric, do you want to add anything, or Vanessa?
Yeah, I've looked at reinsurance in some depth, including with our payers through our Payer Executive Leadership Council through NAMCP. And in the United States, at least, and I can't speak to other markets, reinsurance is at best a short-term Band-Aid for just a few instances. As Anita mentioned, it is meant for the exception rather than the rule. And what will happen as more and more of these therapies enter the marketplace is it will no longer be the exception, the house burning down. It will be something more common, like having your roof damaged by a hailstorm or something like that. But the other consideration is that on the payer side, they are terrified that cell and gene therapies represent a reason why the reinsurance agencies, and there are, 8 to 10 in the United States that are major ones, will not reinsure the entire health plan if they have too many, very costly, arguably, cell and gene therapies hit the plan. And as Anita mentioned, there are other strategies. The problem is the world wasn't built for single administration therapies or therapies at this cost point. And even when we do look at amortized payback models, there are some real practical issues that have to be handled at the health plan level, at the provider level, that get lawyers and other folks involved that are more complicated. And once you lift up the hood, then there would need to be a broader emphasis to routinely get to a 5-year payback model, or it may have to be driven by a group like CMS doing a demonstration project like you've seen with value-based pricing or health quality measures or what have you in the U.S. In the short term, the easiest thing is a payback model that is 2, no more than 3 years, because that's the beneficiary churn rate and dealing with the portability. And if you look at some of the scenarios, which it wasn't an advanced therapy, but the launch of Spinraza at an arguably costly price point, the reason that it was palatable to payers is because the initial $750,000 year one cost was broken out into things they could cash flow, so smaller payments. So if you're able to fit within the world the payers work, at least in the short term, while you're pushing for something like maybe a longer term amortization process that's linked to, getting to a place where evidence development is recognized as a journey, not a destination, then we ultimately will get there. But in the short term, there are some more limited options, but a lot of things are being discussed. There have also been issues like the Cancer Drug Fund example and high-risk pools. High-risk pools are challenging because they don't really solve for the problem. There are a bunch of international examples of why that doesn't really work the way you think it did. But something like a fund initially to provide a bridge is probably a more where a payer or group of stakeholders would pay in a very low dollar per member per month rate is probably but you've got to have a group to push it to really get it going before it could take hold. But that's another solution that's been advanced.
And is it conceivable then, perhaps, that if some of these nearer term solutions are identified, that we would envision over the long term, like with genomic sequencing, that the cost of some of these therapies would come down and might begin to apply on a broader scale to bigger disease areas, therefore, making it more attractive for companies to be involved in developing for those bigger markets. But there's a period of time where we're going to struggle with the ones that we have until we get to that point, or do you see the price points as always being higher?
I think it depends, on the scenario. The moment that one of the broader cell and gene therapies launches, you will have had to have done extensive work thinking about who gets the therapy, because there will be tremendous pushback, because even at a fraction of the cost of what we see with cell and gene therapies launching today and that have launched within the last couple of years, the system won't support a price point that's that high. And you've got on the other side, aside from reimbursement being the great equalizer for these therapies and their access, it's the cost of goods for manufacturing them. So arguably, as it does go down, we may see some efficiencies, but it's hard to tell. We're already seeing second and third generation cell and gene therapy models be applied, almost immediately after we saw first generation launch. I think there's just a lot of activity.
Yeah. You definitely see that there's a lot of activity and a lot of changes, a lot of adaptations of systems much more quickly than ever has before. So, I kind of feel that sometimes this gets a little bit negative, but the good part, to bring that back to the patient perspective, is that I'm just really heartened by hearing that these conversations are happening. There are opportunities and there are ideas and ways to solve these problems. It's not going to happen, like I said before, it's not going to happen overnight, but the convening and being able to bring the parties together is heartening for us as patient advocacy groups and patient communities, because the decisions are happening. And if you look back historically, the time that it took to get to this point versus what's going forward, it's just going to be an exponential change in time and adaptations of new systems.
And I think that
we've got about
go ahead, Greg.
We've got about 5 minutes left. So there are a couple of questions I wanted to maybe see if we could get to in that time frame. I think this is maybe directed towards Vanessa, but a question that asks about, along with natural history, there are social determinants to health that determine outcomes as well. Are we going to be measuring, or presumably would RareX be measuring those variables as well? So the thing is, I think that RareX or any other system, quality of life and social determinants of health are something that's really, really important and often overlooked in data collection and natural history. It is something that we do, in terms of formation of RareX and the standardized data that structured data we were talking about. It is something we are focusing on because, the health of the patient is one thing, but the health of everything else that's around them, their family and the family structures is a determinant that we want to make sure we're measuring. Even in the natural history, within response to treatment, that could be the one of those surrogate endpoints that you look at. There is something that actually improves quality of life versus the actual symptom itself. So that is something that we're looking at in terms of part of the natural history and looking into the quality of life piece. There doesn't need to be, that you don't need to do
a long survey about it, but it is something that we need to figure out what are the big things that need to be asked of rare disease across the board that can say these are the social determinants that actually look at outcomes. So yes, that is something that we are interested in and are talking about already, meaning the questions that we actually want to ask.
And I think on a related note, but one of the questions was, what can we, presumably as patient communities, do to push for more collective and collaborative data capture globally? To a variety of your points earlier, that seems to be an important need. How do we address it? And what can patient communities do?
Yeah, patient communities, if you are ready to collect data around your patient group, one, it's just identifying where your patients are. If you're going to collect data, make sure, if you're going to collect data in just a contact registry, you're going to collect data in natural history, make sure that whatever you're embarking on, whether it be a human subject protection, IRB covered protocol, make sure that your consent is one that the data you're collecting is able to be connected to other data sources in a non-anonymized way, meaning that doesn't need to be de-identified, because as technology moves forward, these data sources are going to be able to be connected much more effectively, either through linkages or direct patient connections, so that when you're collecting your data around there, making sure you're keeping that global focus. You might have a group of 50 in the United States right now, but there might be another 150 in India, and there might be another 150 in Australia. And being able to make sure your consent and what you're doing and how you're collecting the data is as compliant as possible and as governed as possible is really, really important. If you have any questions about that, please email me or go to rarex.org. There's a massive piece about the education and community engagement piece for RareX on that program, because even if you're not collecting data directly onto the RareX platform, it is something that we're really, really focused on, making sure that data collected from patient groups is really out of the gate fit for purpose, making sure you're collecting data that can be used and connected across the board, and that is not going to get stuck in a silo and get stagnant. Because when we're talking about changing the structure and looking at value-based, accessibility to data, to biopharma, to researchers, to clinicians in a way that's much more open is really going to be the key to driving down costs, especially on the front end, looking at natural history studies and that sort of thing.
Well, I want to, we're just about out of time, so I really want to thank Vanessa, Eric, Anita for your involvement in the panel, for a great discussion. I want to thank those who have tuned in and encourage you all to join the session on either navigating the transition of care for young adult patients, which is coming up, and mitigating familial family financial toxicity through planning. And I'd encourage you to tune in and continue to tune in throughout the rest of the summit. And thank you again, everybody, for your time and your interest.
Thank you.
Thanks,
everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.